When we talk about the future, it's kind of hard not to picture, like, self-driving cars, right?
It's right up there with flying cars, I think, in the public imagination.
Yeah. And speaking of which, you've sent us a really interesting article about Waymo.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. So we're going to deep dive into how Waymo went from, like, this Google experiment to maybe, just maybe, the future of transportation. Buckle up.
What gets me is how they took it from this, like, almost sci-fi concept at Google X to having cars racking up millions of miles on actual roads.
I know, right? And the article mentions this guy, Sebastian Thrun, who was super instrumental in those early days. Some of our listeners might even recognize his name.
Oh, yeah, he's a big deal in, like, the robotics and AI world.
Can you give us a little background on him? Why was he the guy for this project?
Well, I mean, Stanford professor, key player in building that self-driving car that won DARPA's challenge back in, 2005?
Oh, right. That was huge.
Exactly. I mean, Google wasn't messing around. They brought in someone who, like, literally helped pioneer the field of autonomous vehicles.
And so no pressure there.
Right. Talk about a dream team.
And those early prototypes, the article mentioned Prius is rigged up with all these sensors just driving around collecting data.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild to think about. Like, those are the baby steps.
It's like comparing the Wright brothers plane to a modern jet, you know?
Totally.
Those Priuses were all about teaching the AI to understand the world, right?
Yeah.
Think about the sheer volume of data, though.
Yeah.
Every lane change, every pedestrian, every pigeon crossing the road, millions of miles worth.
The ultimate driver's ed program, but for, like, a computer brain. So why the work with existing cars? Why not just build a self-driving car from scratch?
Oh.
Which is what they did with the Google Firefly.
The Firefly was huge. It was Google saying, hey, we're not just adding self-driving tech to cars anymore. We're designing for a future where humans don't drive.
Bold move.
Right. It was small, no steering wheel, no pedals. Kind of cute, honestly.
Yeah.
But it was this huge shift in their thinking, a real statement of intent.
Like they were planting their flag in the future, basically.
Which brings us to Waymo. Why the name change? Why spin off from Google?
I think it marks a key transition, moving from like a research project to a full-blown company. Waymo. It stands for A New Way Forward in Mobility.
I know, right? It's like they were signaling they weren't just playing around anymore. They were serious about changing how we think about transportation entirely.
So it's not just about building cool tech. It's about, like, reshaping our cities, our commutes, everything.
That's exactly it.
And to really pull that off, they needed to team up, right?
Yeah.
The article mentioned partnerships with Chrysler, Jaguar.
Right.
Those weren't just, like, publicity stunts, were they?
No. It was about showing that Waymo's tech could work in the real world, in cars people actually drive. The Chrysler Pacifica minivans, those became the basis for Waymo One, their ride-hailing service.
Which is a whole other level of wow factor, by the way.
I know, right? And Jaguar, that was about tapping into, like, the luxury market, a different kind of customer.
It makes sense. Cast a wider net.
Exactly. Each partnership had its own advantages as Waymo took their tech from the lab to the streets.
Speaking of Waymo One, what were those early days like? Was it smooth sailing, or were there some, shall we say, bumps in the road?
I mean, can you imagine? You order a ride and the car just shows up, no driver.
That's got to be a trip, right? Like, is this real life?
Totally. I think it was a mix of excitement and, well, maybe a little healthy skepticism.
Makes sense. But even the coolest tech has its growing pains, right? Did Waymo One run into any major roadblocks early on?
Well, for starters, you're not just dealing with traffic, you're dealing with regulations.
Oh, right, of course.
Every city has its own rules, and for self-driving cars, that was totally uncharted territory, legally speaking. Plus, let's be real, people were bound to have safety concerns.
Understandably so.
It's brand new technology. Trust takes time.
Absolutely. Which makes me wonder, what is going on inside those cars? The article kept mentioning Waymo Driver.
Yeah, the brains of the operation.
Sounds more like a personal chauffeur than like a piece of software.
It's a good way to think about it. I mean, you've got your cutting-edge sensors, LiDAR, radar, cameras.
Right.
But here's the thing. It's not just gathering information. It's actually making sense of it all in real time.
Okay, so walk me through that. How does it work?
So you've got LiDAR mapping out the surroundings in 3D, radar seeing through stuff like fog and rain, cameras recognizing objects. Waymo Driver blends all that together to make decisions, just like a human driver would, only, ideally with fewer fender benders.
So it's processing this constant stream of data.
Yeah.
But isn't the really tricky part dealing with the unpredictability of us human drivers?
Exactly. We're not exactly known for following the rules all the time.
Definitely not.
And that's what makes Waymo drivers so impressive. It's not just reacting to what's happening right now. It's actually anticipating what could happen.
Whoa.
Like a cyclist might swerve, someone might jaywalk. It's all about probabilities and split-second decisions. Just like human drivers, but on a whole other level.
It's like giving a computer a crash course in human psychology and teaching it to drive at the same time.
Pretty much. But, Waymo's not the only game in town. You've got Tesla making big claims with their self-driving features, and then there's Cruise in San Francisco running those robo-taxis.
It's getting crowded out there.
Yeah.
What's Tesla's approach? Are they doing anything radically different?
It's interesting. They're really leaning into their AI, learning from the sheer volume of data their cars are already collecting.
Bold.
Definitely a gamble. And speaking of different, Cruise is all about the city.
Yeah, they're hyper-focused on those urban environments, aren't they?
Yeah, the robo-taxis in San Francisco are a good example. Navigating those streets, that's a serious accomplishment.
It's like the ultimate test track.
Right. And then you've got others like Aurora, they're focused on long-haul trucking, and Zoox, they're developing a purpose-built robo-taxi. It's a real mix of players, each with their own strengths.
It's like everyone's racing toward the same finish line, but taking different routes to get there. So where does that leave Waymo? What makes them stand out in this increasingly competitive field?
Well, for one, they've got experience on their side. They've been at this longer than almost anyone else, gathering billions of miles worth of data, both simulated and real world.
That's huge. Talk about a head start.
Right. That's a massive advantage when you're training AI. And second, their approach is very meticulous, very safety-oriented. They're not just about being first, they're about getting it right.
Which, in this case, is critical.
Absolutely. And the third thing, they're thinking big picture. Waymo isn't just about passenger vehicles. They're making moves in freight and logistics with Waymo Via.
Oh, right. Autonomous trucking. It's one thing to have robo-taxis, but 18-wheelers without drivers, that's a whole other level.
And it makes sense. I mean, long-haul trucking has all these challenges. Driver shortages, safety concerns, efficiency issues. Imagine trucks that can operate almost 24/7, making deliveries faster and potentially even safer.
That would be huge. Right.
Right. We're not just talking about disrupting transportation. We're talking about disrupting entire industries.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it. But let's be honest, even with all this progress, even with everything we've talked about, there's still this big question looming. How realistic is a truly driverless future?
It's a lot to process, right? I mean, it's not every day you talk about, fundamentally changing how transportation works.
It's a huge shift. And with any big change, there are going to be, some speed bumps along the way. We've talked tech, we've talked competition. But what about just, people? Are we even ready for a world without drivers? It's one thing to let Spotify pick a song for you, but your life in the hands of an algorithm, that's a whole other level of trust.
Totally. And it's not just about being comfortable with the tech. There are some serious ethical questions. Like, how does a self-driving car decide what to do in an accident that's unavoidable? That's not just engineering, that's philosophy.
So we're basically trying to program a moral compass into these machines.
It's really uncharted territory, and it brings up all these questions we need to be thinking about now, not 5 years from now when the tech is already here.
For sure. And what about the economic side of things? I mean, if we've got all these self-driving trucks and taxis on the roads, what happens to the people whose jobs depend on driving?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
And it's not as simple as jobs going away. It's about jobs changing, We could see whole new industries popping up around managing these autonomous fleets.
Yeah, retraining and education, that becomes even more important.
Absolutely. We've got to make sure people are prepared for this shift.
Okay, so let's say, just for a second, that Waymo and everyone else, they figure it all out, the tech is perfect, people are on board, and boom, we're living in a driverless world. What does that actually look like?
Well, for one, way fewer accidents. I mean, most crashes involve some kind of human error, right? So if you remove that, you could potentially save a lot of lives.
That's huge.
Right. But it goes beyond just safety. Think about cities designed differently. Less space needed for parking, less traffic, maybe even lower emissions because these cars are optimizing routes and fuel efficiency.
It's like hitting the reset button on urban planning.
Exactly. Imagine cities with more green space, more places for people to walk around.
And don't forget about people who can't drive now for whatever reason.
Right. This tech could give them so much independence.
It's exciting to think about, even with all the unknowns.
Totally. It's not just about the tech itself. It's about how we use it to create the future we want.
Well said. So to the listener who sent in this Waymo article, you've definitely given us a lot to think about. This deep dive has been a wild ride, and who knows what the future holds. Thanks for listening.